I think I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I appreciate you taking the time to educate yourself on post-fire restoration, particularly in the lake fire. We've all gone through this recent event, and now we are preparing for what to do next, including winter storms and how to recover. Before I begin or introduce my speaker, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce Sedgwick Reserve. We are your hosts this evening in the Santa Ynez Valley at the end of Brinkerhoff in Santa Barbara County. The Sedgwick Reserve is a nature reserve and field station that is administered by the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'd like to acknowledge that our lands were the original stewardship of the Chumash, and we are proud to continue that legacy of proper stewardship and responsibility to the earth and its people. University of California Santa Barbara reserves include Coal Oil Point, which is right next to campus if you've been there, Carpinteria Salt Marsh, Santa Cruz Island Reserve, Rancho Marino, Sierra Nevada Aquatic Research Center, and Valentine Camp up in by Mammoth Lakes. And we're part of a network of 41 reserves administered by the University of California, covering most of the major ecosystems in the state. Overall, our main mission is for research, education, outreach, and stewardship. We produce a lot of publications from original scientific research that's performed at these field stations. We protect a number of native species. We have a number of students that come, mostly university students, but we do have a number of K through 12 programs, and we're an important part of the state's initiative for 30 by 30 to protect more lands. Part of our outreach would be public events. One such event would be the barn dance that's held here. You are invited to join us on Saturday, November 4th, and Nikki will drop a link into the chat. Our main mission is research. So the majority of the support that we do is for people to come to the field station to do research on anything from oak restoration to astronomy. We have a lot of primary ecological research that we do on pollinators and plants, interactions, evolutionary questions, animal distributions and behaviors, soil science, oak restoration, and sorry, this is a picture of some root plots here where we're watching the roots grow in different conditions. So the prescribed burn research that we do is actually a growing aspect of the research here at Sedgwick with the wildfire and also with prescribed burns that we do every year. A lot of the focus is on fire ecology and behavior and how different habitat, different fuel and fire regimes will affect fires going forward, and how the geology and hydrology affect the fire behavior. A lot of that research includes remote sensing. So we do have collaborations with NASA and a couple of other groups. This is part of a federal initiative to try to understand wildfire more closely, what pre-fuel conditions look like, what active fire dynamics are, and then post-fire impacts. Another initiative is to train people to do prescribed burns. The California state has a goal of treating 400,000 acres annually for prescribed burns. However, we need to skill up the workforce that are able to do those kinds of prescribed burns. We're having one such training that'll be November 13th through 15th. And there's a tentative burn date there in the middle. We might do a small 25-acre training burn that includes a lot of the experimentation. But you would receive a notification from the Air Quality Control Board on the day that that would happen. So the lake fire did affect us here. It started at Zaca Lake on July 5th, as you know. I think it peaked at around 38,000 acres with 3,300 personnel. The picture here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this t-shirt shape is the Sedgwick Reserve. It's 6,000 acres. It looks comparably larger just because this is the flatlands and there's not as much aspect as all the hills that are up in here. Our field station and where I'm sitting now are down at the south end, and they were not affected by the fire. About half of the reserve is burnt. That's that section there in yellow. And it started up in the north area and came around the east as the fire progressed. One of the effects, we are expecting wildfire, back burning, and controlled burns to be part of that footprint. One things that we're dealing with now that's a subject for tonight's talk is the effect of a lot of the bulldozer lines. A lot of our roads were along or near creek beds, including Figueroa Creek, and we're trying to prepare ourselves for what comes next with storms. And so that leads us to tonight's speaker, Rich Casale. Just to give you a brief introduction, Rich has a long line of, of credentials and experiences here. I'm just going to touch on some of them. It's going to take me a minute. Rich Casale has spent over 50 years working for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services, that's the NRCS, as a district conservation in the Monterey Bay area until 2017. Then as NRCS Natural Resource Restoration Contractor and Erosion Control Specialist, assisting California communities to recover from devastating wildfires and storm events. Rich is a certified professional in erosion and sediment control and an international certification program that he co-founded in 1982. Rich has extensive on-the-ground experience from serving over thousands of land owners with their erosion control and natural resource management needs in all types of land use. He has written numerous technical articles and publications, including Post-Fire Wildfire Restoration Guide for the NRCS. Rich has also co-authored the 2019 Fire Recovery Guide published by the California Native Plant Society. Rich has a Bachelor's of Science degree in the Natural Resources Management from Humboldt State University, now Cal Poly Humboldt. He and his wife own and operate a small ranch in Santa Cruz County, where Rich practices natural resource management firsthand. I'd also like to point out that Rich came out to visit Sedgwick personally, and he is a wealth of information. He actually grew up in this area. He's very familiar with the land, and we're so appreciative to have him tonight as tonight's speaker. Thank you, Rich.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm really happy to be here this evening with everyone. And I think the format will allow you to ask questions as we go, but we'll also leave time after the presentation for any other questions that might come up. As Heather said, I was born and raised in Santa Barbara. I went to Santa Barbara City College in 1967. My family and I were evacuated from our home following the 1967 coyote fire that, lit up Santa Ynez Mountains there. In 1974, I started my career with NRCS in Santa Barbara. So very familiar with the county, both growing up, but also working for NRCS. In 1975, I moved to the Monterey Bay area, and my first fire was the Marble Cone Fire in the Big Sur area in 1977. Since then, I've been on a couple of dozen different fires throughout the state, from Malibu to the wine country, and then back again, including the Thomas Fire in 2018 and the Alisal Fire in, I believe, 2022. So my experience and expertise in post-restoration following wildfire, I like to say, is on the ground experience and expertise, because what I learned in college almost 50 years ago was sparse when it came to erosion control and post-fire issues. And besides, what we were doing back then and what we're doing now is completely different. In fact, back in the 60s and 70s, we were seeding all the wildfire areas with ryegrass or some other invasive non-native plant material. So tonight I'm going to be talking, and I'll bring up my PowerPoint here. Wait a second, I shouldn't have done that. I want to share screen. let's see here. Share screen, share screen. Okay, here we go. Now where did it go? Oh, well, it was here before. Hold on.
All right, take a minute.
Okay, we have to go to my documents, huh? I think I ended up closing. Documents. Okay. You don't see this on the screen yet, right?
No, not yet.
Okay. So I'll minimize it and see what I can do now with sharing my screen.
Okay.
Okay. Is that working so far?
Yeah, it looks like it's coming up.
Okay. From here, I want to go to slideshow. Thanks for everybody's patience here. Okay.
All right, there we
Is
go.
it full screen on your side?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks again. Um, okay, so the title of my presentation is Post-Wildfire Restoration. I'm going to try to relate it as much as I can to the 2024 Lake Fire, but there may be some more generic information in my slideshow as we go that would apply here just as well. So once again, I'm a certified professional erosion and sediment control specialist, have been for over 40 years. And in the last 7 years, been working mostly on wildfire restoration throughout California for NRCS. So an overview of the presentation. I want to talk first about safety and health hazards, an understanding of wildfire impacts before we skip to the chase, post-wildfire assessment, post-wildfire overarching concepts. And these are all important before you decide on any kind of recovery or restoration practice. The role of nature in wildfire recovery. And then, last but not least, post-wildfire restoration practices. And these will be both what to do and what not to do. And then I'll summarize with my top 10 lists. So that's the overview. So some things to keep in mind when addressing fire damage areas. First and foremost, as I mentioned, and where is my, there, is safety first. Being aware or, searching out potential safety hazards before you go tromping over the landscape, whether it's, in a consulting role or whether it's your property or you're there just to check things out. Fire landscape can be very damaging, very dangerous. Fire damage and destroyed trees, and some of the damaged trees are still falling weeks and months after the fire, especially when you're in a forested area. The root systems have been compromised. Large branches may fall from these trees. They may uproot. So be very cautious. I usually wear a hard hat when I'm out doing any kind of assessment where there's tree cover. Also, toxic ash and airborne soil and dust. A lot of times we don't think that we're inhaling toxic fumes, or ash can be toxic, particularly around structures and homes and buildings. So I always wear an N95 mask when I'm in areas like this. When I don't, I go into like a coughing spasm that will probably last for a day or more. So I've learned from experience to keep my mouth protected and my lungs protected. So unstable slopes, certainly debris flow and soil erosion are going to be an issue once it starts raining. Generally speaking, we usually don't see these issues until we have ground saturation, but following fire, we can see these issues almost immediately. For example, the debris flow in Montecito, which I was there at, occurred and actually helped put the Thomas fire out, but we received a half an inch of rain in 5 minutes. That debris flow ended up killing 24 people. Soil erosion normally isn't an issue until you have ground saturation and you have overland flow. But what we find on the landscape after fire is we find a lot of loose sediments, dry gravel, loose soil, fractured rock that can start mobilizing with the first rains. In fact, the ravel, which is just loose sediments that have been deposited on the landscape over years, may start mobilizing just with gravity. There's nothing holding it back. In other words, all the ground cover is gone in some of these areas, which will quickly fill up ditches and drains and the like, and waterways. So, but these unstable areas, you need to be very careful. Even walking through mud, might seem benign or what have you, but it can cause you to lose your balance or be swept away, depending on whether or not it's connected to a debris flow or not. Rockfall, where we do have rocks in the landscape, is a problem that a lot of times we don't think about when we're out assessing a burn area. A lot of this rock you may think is stable, but a lot of it may have fractured in the fire. A lot of this rock may have been perched behind vegetation or trees that are no longer there, and is just sitting on the landscape, just waiting to be launched. And as I said earlier about the soil erosion, the rock can start falling even without rainfall. The other thing happens is that you have soil erosion around these rocks once we do have rainfall, and that can launch some of this rock fall as well. Polluted water supplies, drinking water supplies for livestock and other animals can be a safety hazard for both people and animals. Sinkholes, buried plastic conduits, pipes, drainage systems, redwood septic tanks, anything that's buried in the ground that may have vaporized, may form sinkholes on the surface. Where the fire is burned extremely hot, root systems may have vaporized as well, creating caverns just beneath the soil. The soil may look stable, but I can tell you from experience, there are times I have sunk down to my waist when I thought the ground was solid, and it was a sinkhole just lurking inches below the surface. So we have to be very careful when we're walking around these landscapes. Hazardous structures and utilities, particularly structures that haven't completely been lost or vaporized, are dangerous to be walking around. I can't tell you how many nails that have gone through my foot over the years, but they're very dangerous sites that kind of stay around the perimeter of them if you're investigating or have a structure that's burned on your property. And obviously, utilities can be very, very dangerous as well. That may be compromised, whether it's electrical or gas or water or cable or what have you. Road washouts and vaporized culverts are obviously a dangerous potential safety hazard. And sometimes the road may not look like it's a safety hazard, but a lot of the vaporized culverts are plastic culverts. And some of these older culverts didn't have much, we'll call it freeboard or head or ground surface between the top of the culvert and the road surface. So sometimes it's a matter of inches, maybe less than a foot. So if there's no culvert there and it's just an open hole, just the weight of the vehicle could cave the road in. These areas would also be first to erode out, and you would find road washouts in these areas first, generally. Weakened bridges, the bridge may still look stable, but not knowing where and how the fire, burned around these bridges can be very dangerous and could easily collapse with just a car or a truck driving over it without inspecting it thoroughly. I mean, I normally, when I go into a fire area where I don't think anybody has been, besides a CAL FIRE bulldozer or something, I will get out of my vehicle and look to see if the culvert's in place, or make sure that the bridge abutments have not been compromised by either soil, slope instability issues, or fire. And then displaced wildlife. I've come across rattlesnakes, horses, cattle, deer. Frightened livestock, can be dangerous. They don't run around you; they run over you oftentimes because they're scared. So you need to be aware that you might come across that following fire as well. Flooding, both on property but also downstream of properties. And a lot of people feel, oh my God, the fire didn't reach our property. We're home safe, but not so quick because of the flooding potential downstream, particularly adjacent to the fire area. Having said that, flooding, it can also, not just from more runoff because the vegetation isn't on the landscape, but a lot of the waterways and stream water courses are filling with sediment and debris, not leaving as much capacity for water. So flooding is almost a sure thing, particularly in the first season following fire, but it may be an issue for several years after fire. I tell people to really be prepared for more than one rainy season following fire, because it takes a while for nature to, restore the damage, and any practices that we put on the landscape to help nature. Improper and high risk practices. And unfortunately, I don't get to everyone before they become their own worst enemies. But a lot of times these high risk factors also have a high potential for failure. And that might include everything from improperly placed or located sandbags, plastic sheeting, erosion control blankets, or other measures. So understanding some wildfire impacts. I'm going to say right up front that my talk is not going to cover everything in minute details. I had to kind of summarize even wildfire impacts, because obviously there's there's a lot of additional impacts I could easily list here and talk about. But in general, wildfire affects soil health, erosion hazard, slope stability, water quality, runoff volume and velocity, so the amount of runoff, but also the speed of that runoff, air quality, plant communities, fish and wildlife resources, homes and other structures, businesses, including ag businesses, and of course, human lives. Additionally, wildfire impacts, high intensity fires can burn hotter and destroy more completely plants and roots and resident seed bank. Typically, high intensity fires are fires, when you look at the landscape, that have burned materials down to a moonscape, maybe leaving white ash and light gray ash throughout the area. A lot of times the higher intensity fires are areas where fire hasn't been in the landscape for 50 or more years. I was told on the lake fire that there were obviously areas of the lake fire that perhaps haven't burned in over 100 years. So low intensity fires typically burn cooler, but they can smolder and still have a severe impact on the soil. So just because it's low intensity doesn't mean that there aren't going to be problems with regeneration or soil erosion issues or land instability or any other impacts or things that would occur after fire. So starting with assessing wildfire, we want to determine the degree of damage, overall degree of damage. And one way we do that is to evaluate the intensity and the severity of the fire. I like to know a little bit about the site history. How long has it been since natural fire? But as Heather was mentioning in her introductory remarks, some landscapes have been purposely caught on fire, using fire as a tool in the landscape to help, reduce the threat of catastrophic fire during, a fire that has started in the landscape from other means. The damages from a firefighting effort, and I think this is key, particularly on landscapes where firefighting effort took place on the ground with bulldozers and hand crews and trucks and back fires and what have you. And sometimes this is the first part of any property assessment that I will evaluate first, because sometimes the firefighting agency will go in and do damage control of their firefighting damages by installing water bars or doing other grading work or breaking up the brush in a flop and scatter format and placing it on burn areas or over stream banks or what have you. So this is something that can create more problems for the winter. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I get into the body of the slideshow. And then the degree of tree and plant loss. A lot of times you see, oh, the whole landscape burned, but how much of the tree and plants were lost, is important. To what degree did they burn to the ground? Did they just get scorched? Did they, burn into the root system? So the degree of tree and plant loss is important too. Again, it's very important to evaluate, to know where we're at. because the last thing you want to do is to be competing with regermination of native seed bank or regeneration of plant roots or plants that were there before. If they were there before, they're probably a better plant material than anything we would put on the landscape, because anything we put on the landscape is going to have to adapt to that fire burned area and start from scratch. And I would rather use the material that we already have there. And it's a more natural way of looking at post-fire restoration anywhere where we can do this. Having said that, there may be opportunities to do plantings and even do seeding, but we'll reserve that for site-specific situations, perhaps around buildings or structures or waterways and maybe roads. So we're also going to look at the damage to infrastructure, to homes and buildings, access roads, utilities, fence lines, whatever is on the landscape that got compromised or destroyed. And then obviously the actual damage to soil, to slopes and watercourses. And I'll talk about that as we go through the slideshow a little bit more detail. So in identifying some of the potential hazards during this assessment would include where there might be debris flow hazards, landslide hazards, other potential slope failures like cut banks along roads, stream bank erosion, soil erosion areas, including areas that could become gullies, canyons as a result of runoff. Downstream flooding may be a hazard in some areas, depending on the drainage area or the watershed of the landscape that was burned. Looking at watershed and waterway impairments, which would include things like debris and stream courses, things that might dam up or redirect stream courses or cause flooding or stream bank erosion. This is a very site-specific call, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in the slideshow. Ground subsidence or potential hazards where sinkholes might occur or already exist. And last but not least, in addition to other things that I may have left out, would be the invasion of invasive plants. 50 or 100 years ago, everything that came back on a fire burned landscape would be the plants that have been there for hundreds of years. But now we have hundreds of invasive plants that just love this medium to grow in and be first back instead of the fire following plants or the plants that are already there as part of the seed bank or root systems. So in some areas it's worse than others, but it's something to look out for, are the invasive plant materials that are going to want to colonize following fire. So some overarching concepts before deciding what to do, if anything, is to consider nature as your first and your best post-wildfire restoration practices. In the industry, we talk about best management practices, and we almost never consider doing nothing, and nothing is really not nothing. Nothing is letting nature take its course. And so a best management practice in this case may be nature, which is maybe nothing, is letting nature take the course. And understanding natural processes and the role that they play in wildfire recovery. So understanding those natural processes, recognizing that fire is natural in the landscape. Soil erosion is a natural and land-forming process. And soil erosion is going on irregardless of a wildfire. It's going on even when there isn't a wildfire. We see this after a wildfire because we see erosion in the landscape under all those plants that burn. So We know that it's occurring. We know that sedimentation is on the landscape because it's in full view following a fire. So, and it's going to occur after the fire and probably at a higher rate than it would when we had plants on the landscape. But nonetheless, it is a land forming process. I'm an erosion control specialist, and I'll be the first one to tell you that we're not going to stop all erosion from occurring, whether it's on a landscape that wasn't burned or a landscape that was severely burned. Many plants actually depend on fire to regenerate. That's true with knobcone pines. I'm not quite sure if it's true with coulter pine, but it might well be. But even redwoods regenerate when fires get hot enough to release seed and to regenerate the plant. Some plants and grasslands are also stimulated by fire. And we want to be aware of these things before we go seeding grasslands or putting in plants that are going to slow down natural regeneration and regermination processes. So continuing on, looking at the role of nature in wildfire recovery, one really big practice that nature is doing for us, particularly in areas where you have lighter burns, heat, and smoke damage to trees, whether they were deciduous trees that had leaves on them during the burn, or whether they were, evergreens. You're going to have a tremendous amount of leaf drop, which you can see, and this is a picture in the lake fire in the background here. A tremendous amount of leaf drop, and you might not see it in the first few weeks, but you'll see it definitely before the first rains. So this is nature protecting the soil before the rains start and covering. And generally, wind will blow the leaves away from the trees as well, and you will get some coverage from this leaf drop and litter beyond wherever the tree cover or the plant cover was. Ash in the first few storms is very absorbent. It doesn't really mobilize that quickly. Saying that, leaving it, a lot of people say, rake it, remove it so you can seed underneath it, because you can't seed ash. You won't get anything to grow in ash. So in areas where grass seeding might be an option, and there is a dense cover of ash might need to be raked away. But in most cases, I would leave the ash for the rainfall. Burn plant parts and whatever I said there. Roots, burn parts and roots that may still regenerate and or regerminate from resident seed bank is actually pretty quick. In fact, you can even see in this slide some sprouting. I took this picture a little over a month ago, I believe. So within about 4 weeks of the fire, you're starting to see evidence of regrowth. And sometimes we're too quick on the chase, and we want to make everything look pretty right away, but let's give nature a chance first. So fire-related debris in streams, as I mentioned earlier, is a site-specific call and actually can be very beneficial over removing that debris, thinking that we're going to leave more room for water and sediment, or we're going to prevent that debris from causing a dam and blowing out and causing other damages. But that is something that really should be looked at by a professional, not to mention that any work in a stream is likely to require permits. So when determining erosion potential, it's important to understand the role of soil erosion factors, those being the kind and amount percentage of vegetative cover, not just as grass cover is different from deep-rooted woody vegetation, which is different from complete coverage to 10% coverage. So evaluating the amount of vegetative cover, but the kind of vegetative cover. For example, deep-rooted woody material is ideal for slopes, particularly slopes where there's potential for failure or landslides. Grass cover on slopes, not so much. Grass is herbaceous, it's shallow rooted, it doesn't have the strength or the root system to combine the surface soil with subsurface layers. In fact, in many cases, the grass can and does create higher infiltration capacity. So we may be actually adding more water to potentially unstable slope rather than keeping that slope more stable and less wet. So soil type, and there are many different soil types. All soils were not created equal. They all have, different profile development. They all have different textures and at different horizons in the soil. Some have high water holding capacities, others have none, others are shallow, some are deep. So knowing the soil type, and you can't always use the NRCS soil survey, particularly on small scale properties, because it could likely be another soil than what's mapped on a map. So some kind of soil verification will probably be in order. On larger acres, it seems to be a little bit more accurate, but a lot of times on larger acres, soils types were mapped in complexes. But it is a good planning tool, and it does give you an idea of what the soil might be capable of and what its hazard might be for erosion and runoff. The condition of that soil too, not beyond just the fire effects of that soil, but also its health, the health of the soil prior to the fire. The steepness and the length of the slope. So it's not just about, oh, this is a steep slope, but how long is that slope? Is that slope 100 feet long or is it 1,000 feet long? The longer the slope is, the more water accumulation on that slope. The steeper that slope, the faster the water is going to be moving on that slope. So when you have speed and volume, you have a much higher likelihood of soil erosion occurring. So rainfall amount intensity, most of the time we focus on amount, but it's really more about the intensity and the timing of that rainfall. So for example, you can have, like in Santa Cruz County in 1982, we had our whole seasonal precipitation of rainfall, 30 inches of rain fall in one day. So that's intensity. The following year, we had our rainfall fall over the entire season and had little to none in the way of issues. But in 1982, we had over 10,000 mud and landslides in the Santa Cruz Mountains alone, just because we got all the rain in one day instead of spread out over the entire season. And certainly this would not be complete without talking about human impacts. When we talk about human impacts, we're talking about cuts made into the soil for homes, for buildings, for roads. Cuts in a slope always has a destabilizing effect on the slope. Now, it may have been fine when there was vegetation on the slope. It's a whole totally different story if all that vegetation is gone, and now you have a cut slope along your roadway. But it may also be an issue where you have fill soil, and oftentimes many of our soils, our fill soils, are on the fill side or the downward side of our roads, because a lot of roads are built as cuts and fill slopes. So looser soils have more air pockets, and those air pockets fill with water during after ground saturation, causing the soil to be more mobile and may slip or may erode, but nonetheless, loose soil on the landscape can be more prone to erosion. And it's one reason why I tell folks to minimize land disturbances and removal of dead or burned vegetation on anytime you do any disturbance on that fire burned landscape, you're literally putting air pockets back into the surface soil, disturbing root systems that may regenerate and soil type or soil, seed bank, and loosening that soil. So keep that in mind. So some of the post-fire restoration practices that might play a role include, as I said earlier, doing nothing and using nature as a best management practice. I included seeding up front because everybody wants to seed, and there might be a possible exception of the seeding on range and pasture lands, particularly on range and pasture lands where the range manager had been waiting for fire for many years to get rid of some pesky, invasive or weeds or other plants, and wanted to seed with something more appropriate for livestock, and or in some cases go to a native pasture. So having said that, one grower I was working with in Sonoma County, he told me right out of the gate, he had 2,500 acres that burned on his ranch. And I think this was part of it in this picture. But he says, I've wanted my ranch to burn for over 20 years. He was happy for the burn. He lost some fence line, but he says, besides that, he was jumping in joy. So as I said, seeding is very specific. This picture was taken 2 weeks after the first rains and only 6 weeks after the fire being put out. So if I showed you the before picture of this, everything you see green here was black. So another common practice is mulching. Mulches, depending on the form, but no matter the form, helps to reduce raindrop impact because that's where erosion first starts. Many are not aware that just a single raindrop hits the soil at about 30 miles an hour and can displace soil particles 5 feet in any given direction. So anything that raindrop hits first, we're taking that energy and that potential out of the soil. And I look like I'm talking in a closet. Okay, that looks better. The mulches can help slow runoff, trap sediment, add organic matter to the soil, and retain moisture for regeneration in plants. Having said that, if you're using straw mulch, you want to make sure where you can is to use native grass straw, use rice straw. I don't think you're going to find a certified weed-free straw, but if you can find that, if you just put straw on the landscape, you're going to end up with weeds or the seed from that straw growing in an area where you may not want the competition. But you want to keep that straw cover to less than 2 inches in depth. Once again, putting mulch on the landscape has the effect of postponing, delaying, curtailing plant growth. That's one reason people use it in their landscaping in their gardens, is to suppress weed growth. Well, mulch can do the same thing if you put it on too deep. And we're trying to encourage the plant material, as you can see in this picture. It's lightly spread. Plant material is easily coming up through the straw. And again, I'm going to reserve doing any mulching on areas. This picture happened to be above a road or a building, but if it's just out on the open landscape, I'm going to say you don't even need the straw mulch. Let's rely natural leaf drop, ash, or, whatever nature throws at us. But it's just not realistic on large acreages, hundreds of acres or thousands of acres, to, cover the landscape with some level of straw. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, what about wood chips? Why don't we just burn all the burned material and all the dead material from the fire and chip it and spread that over the landscape? Be very careful with that. Wood chips, again, are a natural plant suppressant. Definitely when you put it on too deep. It also, as it breaks down, it slows down nitrogen fixation. It ties up nitrogen in the soil, so it curtails regeneration. Wood floats, so it can mobilize as well, depending on where it is. And you certainly would not want to be using mulch or wood chips on banks of drainages or stream banks or waterways or that sort of thing for that reason as well, that it will quickly mobilize and be problematic in the waterway. Compost can be considered a type of mulch. Again, you're probably not going to put this on the wide open landscape. Gravels, and a lot of people, as they build back, around homes and structures, utilities, what have you, instead of allowing the plants to grow back or plant something in these areas, there's been a real push to look at hardscapes and gravel as a mulch along and at least within 5 feet of structures, if not further, where that's possible. So gravel can serve the purpose for erosion control, and it can serve the purpose for future fire hazard reduction. Hydromulch, for those of you familiar with the slurry of hydromulch, slurry applying to the soil with or without seed. Again, with seed, it's going to be native seed, or it's going to be a sterile short-term grass, but we're pretty much reserved to site-specific locations. And then you also are going to wait on the straw. If you're going to go with straw, to just before the first rains, because the straw itself can be a fire hazard. Usually the winter or this fall, we're thinking about preparing for winter. But if we haven't had any winter yet, it's still fire season. In fact, it's still very high fire season. And there have been a couple of situations, one actually in a vineyard, where the mulch was put down, in October following the fire, and, before the fire, for erosion control in a new vineyard. And lo and behold, a flying burning ember landed in the mulch and burnt the new vineyard down. So that can also happen in the peripheral areas of the fire area. So, the peripheral area, the interface between what burned and what didn't burn. And sometimes those areas are where you have fire breaks and dozer lines. But if you put a high application of straw along those lines, it can be where a new fire can start. So I always like to make sure that we're not treating and addressing one resource issue only to cause another in the process. So I'm not quite sure how much toxic debris is going to be an issue in the lake fire, but it is certainly going to be an issue where buildings have burnt down, or even vehicles. But sediments as well can be considered toxic, particularly the sediment around anything that has burned down. And practices to consider for toxic debris control are silt socks. They actually make a sock that has more capacity and more ability to contain toxics than just say your fiber roll or your straw roll. But if that's all you have, it's better than nothing. Plastic and tarp covering over the entire area, but you have to be careful with the coverings because the plastic or the tarp covering is an impervious surface. and it will increase runoff. You know, a 40 by 40 piece of, of plastic covering generates 1,000 gallons of water with 1 inch of rain falling on it. So we don't want that 1,000 gallons of water falling off the toxic site onto bare disturbed fire burned soils. Hydromulch has been used in these situations to contain the toxic debris, and also loose straw, or even a combination of all of these things or some of these things. So fiber rolls and straw wattles, it seems again to be one of the first things you see on the landscape following fire, maybe more so than seeding these days now. It seems to be the go-to, and it's all over the place. When done correctly and located correctly, it can help manage and slow runoff, control erosion and sediment. But having said that, as an erosion and sediment control specialist, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, I would say 75% of the applications and locations of these were done incorrectly, improper, to the point where they may be actually causing a problem or creating a new problem, or just being high and dry and not doing anything at all. And I would rather have people spend their time, money, and effort doing the right thing than just putting a smoke screen on the landscape and for it to not have any protection whatsoever. Like, as you can see, half of this photo, they've got straw wattles on a relatively level landscape on a lawn, but the other half is burned. So I understand that, but I think it's way overkill. And the staking is too far apart, should be no more than 3 or 4 feet. And these were not properly dug in or entrenched into the landscape. So they are more or less on the contour, which is an important thing to keep in mind, because fiber rolls can act as little dams and they can act as little diversion ditches. And we don't want them to act as either. We want them to manage runoff and manage sediment and reduce erosion. So proper location and installation is absolutely critical if you're going this route. So I mentioned earlier, minimizing the tree cutting and the plant removal. And unfortunately, I can't get out fast enough. I've seen redwood trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 5+ feet in diameter, with bark 4 to 6 inches thick, cut down to the ground, and the fire only penetrated less than an inch into the bark. The tree wasn't even close to being compromised by the fire, but down came the tree just because it looked like it was going to survive because the trunk was black. So we had to be careful about what to cut, what not to cut. First of all, as I said earlier, they're still doing a job. There's still canopy on the landscape. They're still allowing those raindrops to hit dead plant parts or burn plant. Their root systems are doing something. The damage that you're doing to the soil just with equipment and even if it's done by hand, is loosening the soil up, and you're dropping these when a lot of these trees may not be dead at all and will be coming back to life in a few months. Now, having said that, hazardous trees need to be evaluated, particularly ones over important access routes, over buildings, perhaps over important waterways or bridges, where they may be problematic and causing other issues or safety or health issues. But outside of that, on the open landscape, let's just see what comes back first. And I would say at least through the first winter and the following spring, and perhaps 2 winters, and perhaps just leave them there forever, And it's just one of those things that we feel like we need to do because we want to get rid of the memory. We want to make it look pretty again. But you can do that, but at least wait 6 months to a year before any massive removal of vegetation. And when that's done, still do it carefully so not too much soil and slope disturbance takes place. So correcting drainage issues, and it's one of the things that I look for when I go out on the landscape, because I want to make sure that these drainages have either not been compromised, or that if they will be compromised from erosion or from sediment issues, that we're able to accommodate that extra drainage or that sediment. On some larger landscapes where our drainage systems were probably too small to begin with, we may think about enlarging those systems. We may have to just think about debris and sediment management and catchment. We may just think about, protecting high value structures and our roads, because the little things that we can do in the landscape may not be enough. Again, depending on the areas that burned and how hot it burned, and what that particular site, what those particular site variables are. But it may involve repairing, often enlarging existing systems, and or installing new systems. This may be an opportunity to build back better. For example, replacing a 12-inch plastic pipe with an 18 or a 24-inch metal pipe, or reinstalling that system according to, I want to say, an engineer specification, but you want to do it right so that that system is operating at full capacity. Unfortunately, so many of the systems I see are not operating at full capacity. But if we have an opportunity to build back better, then let's make sure whatever we put back there can operate at full capacity. With drainage system, it's often important to create a backup system. So if a road culvert should block, then you want to make sure that the water that may be flowing over that road gets back into the intended water course and doesn't end up going down the road or someplace where it's not wanted and causes a landslide or a gully or other erosion issue. Now, if it's meant to stay on the road, if the backup system means that the water goes down to the next culvert, then that next culvert has to be large enough to handle that culvert and the upslope culvert. So the larger culvert down road may be a backup system. So like I said, every situation would create, maybe a new set of opportunities. But looking at drainage is really important, because that's going to be the make it or break it in terms of the seriousness of erosion following fire, the seriousness of potential road washouts, and the seriousness of the potential for debris flows and slope saturation. And it may also be an opportunity to relocate existing systems. I find so often that culverts were just poorly located to begin with. Well, this might be an opportunity to put the culvert where it should have been all along. So there are some opportunities for improving drainage, but also protecting properties downstream and where these drainages exist. So talking specifically about culverts and drainage conduits, including roadside ditches, most all are undersized after fire. And I would say most were probably undersized before the fire. And so they are going to be definitely challenged in the first few winters following fire. Additionally, where fires burned the culverts out, if they weren't metal like the one you see in this picture, that means likely any inlet structure and any any outlet structure, any velocity dissipator, including vegetation, is also gone. So for those culverts to run without too many issues, there's going to be inlet protection that's going to be required. Some kind of debris catchment, some kind of sediment catchment, some way of protecting the inlet of that culvert so it doesn't immediate plug in the first few storm events. And at the outlet, particularly if those outlets were on a landscape that was densely covered with vegetation and no longer has that vegetation, those culverts are going to cause an erosion problem at their outlet. So a velocity dissipator may be necessary. That may be rock. It may be a lop and scatter situation of vegetation placed on the landscape to help dissipate the runoff from the culvert. It's just dependent on what we have at hand and what the resources are of the property owner. But we have to be aware that erosion is going to be caused at the outlets of these culverts that weren't burned out, and that keeping them open during the rainy season is going to be a constant monitoring and maintenance chore. And that holds true with the roadside ditches that drain to these culverts. You know, trying to clean these ditches out, particularly before the first rainstorm, to provide some capacity. You don't have to clean them out for hundreds of yards, but particularly in the first 10 or 20 feet, where the stuff that's there is most likely going to be the stuff that's going to immediately plug the culvert. Inlet protection by installing one or two barrier posts a few feet, depending on the size of the culvert, upslope of the culvert, will catch some of the larger debris. Never put any kind of a screen or grate in front of the culvert. Most of these screens and grates are too small and will catch just even small leaves, and you're dead in the water. There's no way for the culvert to function. But if you put something that catches the larger material a few feet upstream, that keeps that culvert inlet open at all times. Even if your debris catchment area gets impacted with debris, it still will allow the water to go around it. And as that debris collects upslope of the culvert inlet, it will also capture the sediment that otherwise might be filling the pipe. So time-wise, I guess we're doing okay. We're getting pretty close here. Repair of damages from the firefighting effort, which I mentioned earlier, including the restoration attempted by others, and it may have been from fire agencies, it may have been contractors that were hired by landowners or public entities, it may be by the landowners themselves, it may be by others. Nonetheless, the damages can be pretty significant, not just from the dozing effort and the trailing and the dozer, tracking on the landscape, or or even the fire crew damages and trailing on the landscape, but from their restoration attempts when they cut down material and pile it up, as you can see in the back of this photo behind the word damages, or their water bar efforts, like you can see right down the middle of this slide, on loose sandy soils on a pretty steep gradient with, it doesn't show, but off-site, basically going on to unprotected landscape. So looking at not only what was done, but how these areas may have been restored by the landowners or fire agencies is as important. And in dozer areas, oftentimes the best thing to do is to remove the berms on either side of the dozer activity so that the water returns to sheet flow. By leaving these berms on these fire breaks, you're containing any water that falls on the fire break or on the dozer or roadways, and creating a channel for that water. By putting water bars and dips across the drainage, you're concentrating that flow and you're redirecting it on a landscape that could easily erode with that concentrated drainage. So I almost never recommend breaks, but when I do, you have to make sure that you have outlet protection, that they're done correctly, that water doesn't follow around the upper end of the water bar, and that they're maintained, because oftentimes they will fill with sediment in the first um, um, storm event, and the water bar itself may become a dam because the material from the ditch in the water bar is left on the downhill side. And if that gets saturated or all the water falls the path of least resistance, it's like little dams breaking along the way. And you just created a mess by something you were doing to try and prevent a problem. So again, the 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 brush should not be left in big piles. When it is left in big piles, it can be left in big, large open areas for future wildlife habitat, but never in the unburned fire interface, and never over a stream bank, never to fill up a gully with it, but to do this with it, to lop it and scatter it. So making your own erosion control blanket by cutting the material up and the branches up and laying them on the landscape to act as your erosion control netting and allowing plants to grow through it. When you put brush on a landscape, densely, nothing can grow through it. Over time, you're literally sterilizing the soil. And so by doing that, you're not going to have root structure, particularly if that's on sloping ground that you're trying to keep stable. So spreading it loosely, keeping that depth below knee height, it's a practice that you'll find in the Forest Practices Manual, the California State Forest Practices Rules. So it's a completely legitimate thing to do. It's one less step of taking that material and making chips out of it. You don't have to go that far. But on the other hand, you want to lay those branches down as flat as you can, drive over them or walk over them to get some of that material in the top few inches of the soil, and then leave well enough alone. I have a handout on that practice as well as most of these practices. So we talked about controlling invasive plants, especially where populations are small and when they occur, because non-native invasive plants will compete with natives and will delay natural recovery. Now, having said that, I always say that any plant is better than no plant for erosion control in the first winter following fire. Not forever, but where you can remove invasives, where you're not going to be, disturbing soils and slopes, then you can try that. If you see them popping up before major rainfall events or after some rainfall events, but otherwise just note those areas or where they are and come back in the spring and take care of them then. So, protecting streams and waterway, some erosion prevention strategies. First and foremost, don't dump anything over the banks. And this includes dead material, rock, broken concrete, you can name just about anything. And I will say that some point over my 50-year career, I've seen on a stream bank for erosion control. So don't dump anything. I would rather see the soil erode from the bank than a refrigerator dumped over the bank to help slow down erosion. Most of anything you dump over the bank will eventually mobilize, or slow down regeneration of bank vegetation, or redirect flows and cause other problems in the drainage. So working with stream size neighbors is important where streams, you don't have full control of the stream, either upstream, downstream, or on the opposite side of the stream. You have to be very careful with spot treatment because spot treatment of stream bank erosion can lead to new problems or problems on neighboring properties that you may be liable for. I would say get a stream expert in before doing anything with a bank erosion problem. In many cases, doing nothing may be the only and best thing that you can do in these situations. Having said that, make sure that you do maintain bank vegetation on either side of that eroded area, including a buffer. And if you can establish a buffer over top of bank along the stream course, even better. Something to slow runoff, slow and catch sediment, absorb runoff before it reaches the stream bank will help reduce erosion or reduce the possibility of erosion getting any worse in areas where it has occurred. We talk about erosion prevention, but there may be areas along some of these stream banks that were eroded before the fire that you're concerned about getting worse now that everything in the watershed has burned to the ground. So this is going to be something you're going to have to monitor and watch for in the following winter or winters, particularly following high flows, particularly when we know there's a large amount of debris in the drainage, fallen trees, etc. And some modification of that debris might be necessary, but as I mentioned earlier, it might be a blessing in disguise. Sometimes when debris lodges in the waterways further up in the watershed, it's a good thing because that means that debris isn't going to be lodging behind culverts, behind bridges further down in the watershed where it may be more problematic. So any work in or along streams are likely to require permits, just to keep that in the back of your mind. Reducing runoff into streams where that's possible. That runoff may also be coming from roadways, from roads and structures, or land use activities that are adjacent to these streams, at least until the stream has had a chance to rehabilitate. So I'm not sure that this is going to be something of a practice following the lake fire, but it is a practice that is commonly used to protect from flooding and debris flows, particularly where high valued structures and roads might be, at risk. So K-rails and other types of deflection measures help to prevent, not necessarily 100%, but can help redirect high flows and debris flows, providing a higher level of protection, not 100% of protection, from flooding and debris, from mudslides, from slope failures that are occurring in the immediate area. And there may be different types that are available, including both temporary and permanent structures, but they should only be installed and located according to a design. And NRCS is a design outlet for these sorts of measures. So you might want to contact NRCS before you design or decide on this method of protection from potential future debris flow. But any of these practices, I wouldn't hold my breath on, particularly if you're putting this up so that you think you can stay in your house when evacuations have been called. because it's not 100%, and you could lose your life, by thinking that you have all these things in place and you don't have to evacuate. So proper placement is critical, and always remember safety first, because measures can give you false hope, um, even properly installed and designed measures. So monitoring and maintenance is going to be key, essential for all practices, including the non-practice. If you decide to do nothing and you're waiting on nature and you're keeping an eye on roadside ditches and culverts that weren't impacted by the fire, but may be impacted by more water or sediment this storm or debris, maintenance could be key. It's not just go out and look at it once and then go back at the end of the year. If you want to protect your roads, if you just want to be able to, remove some sediment or debris from a culvert rather than waiting for the road to blow out, you're going to be, in some cases, tens of thousands of dollars ahead by not allowing that scenario to occur. So repairing defects as soon as possible. In some areas, I will tell folks to remove the culvert entirely and create a drive-through ford, maybe a rocked ford, at least for the first winter before you decide on replacing the culvert, particularly if that culvert was too small, compromised, or plastic and burned out. So a few practices now that may be a waste of your time. I mentioned it earlier. Jute netting, I see very little to no use for jute netting in the lake fire area. There may be some selected use around a building, perhaps, but if you use any of these practices, they should be done correctly. Nothing in this photo has been done correctly. Just what you see in this photo without the plastic in the background, that's a $20,000 job done incorrectly and making the situation worse. But the property owner felt like they had to do something, and they felt like this was giving them peace of mind. And it's the netting is draped over rocks and cut vegetation. There's nothing underneath it. Netting should always be covering a thin layer of straw mulch. That's what it's for, to hold the mulching in place on steep slopes. Straw wattles are not dug in. They're haphazardly placed on the landscape, and they're not staked properly, and probably not the best straw wattle in the world. I just like to use the gunny sack material straw wattles over this style. But if you use this style, then make sure it's done properly. Erosion control blanks say very little need. Make your own erosion control blanket by lop and scattering some cut brush, as mentioned earlier. Sandbags can be a diversion, can be a dam if not done correctly, but they do have a purpose when used properly to protect homes from floodwaters and for possibly redirecting water around important structures. But don't go crazy with them, because you may just be creating a new problem or a problem for a neighbor. Plastic sheeting, I could give you a whole lecture on plastic sheeting. You can see a little bit in the background. It's spaced apart. You can see spaces between the plastic. But once again, 1,600 square feet of plastic sheeting is 1,000 gallons of water coming off of that surface typically on an area that should be protected. Slide debris, unprotected soil, steep slope, an area that's highly prone to erosion. It's almost never done correctly. It's never removed during dry spells during the winter. It's acting as a sterilization, particularly if plastic or black, blue, or brown plastic is used. And it's killing plants that are trying to help or regenerate underneath that plastic to hold the slope together. It's almost always the wrong thing to do. Having said that, there is a place for it, but I wouldn't do it without, proper consultation with an erosion control specialist or a geotech specialist that knows what they're doing. Straw wattles, I already mentioned. Hydromulching, it can be very effective on smaller sites, again, around roads or buildings, maybe around important water courses, but not in the water course, not on stream banks, but with or without seeding. But if that seeding is done, get a seeding recommendation from NRCS. And we're not recommending any over-the-counter erosion control seed, much of which is not native plants. But if it is a non-native, it's going to be a non-native invasive, non-invasive plant that is very short-term, 1 year at the most, and hopefully sterile. So all these things are a waste of time, especially if they're not installed properly. So if you have to install them, use extreme caution. They're not, 100%. They're very risky. They may not even be better than doing nothing at all. And they should only be done at the advice of a certified erosion control specialist, and or someone that can design these features on the landscape. But they're not right in every case. And like I said, in most cases, they're going to make a new problem. And at the very least, they're a high maintenance practice. You can't just lay them on the landscape and then come back in the spring and say, now we can take all this thing off the landscape and do something more permanently. Unfortunately, people wait until the next winter before they take anything off the landscape. And a lot of times they'll leave it for the second winter because they never got to the permanent practice. And that's almost even worse. If you didn't think it was going to work the first year, it's going to be in a dilapidated condition for the second year. And when it fails, it's going to fail catastrophically. And that's almost always what happens with emergency practices. So be very, very careful with putting emergency practices on the landscape. So here's some take-home points. Number 10, get help from NRCS or other professionals. NRCS has a wealth of information and dozens of fact sheets and handouts that were developed for California fires, many of which I authored or co-wrote. Respect the laws of nature. Remember, in the back of your mind, keep in mind less oftentimes is more. One size does not fit all. Almost everything in the landscape is site specific when it comes to altering that landscape following fire to protect that landscape, from winter or anything that winter might bring to us. Minimize soil and slope disturbances as much as you can, recognizing there may not always be the opportunity to do that, but keep it in the back of your mind because some soil disturbances may be required around important roadways and buildings and structures and the like, as I previously mentioned. Look beyond the fence lines and work with thy neighbor. I say this because just like fire, water and erosion processes do not respect property lines. And oftentimes a full or complete solution to a post-fire situation is involving the neighbors. Number 5, an opportunity to build back better, as previously discussed. Remember that emergency measures are extremely risky. There may be a place for them, but hopefully you're consulting with a licensed expert before you install those measures. There's an opportunity to upgrade roads or to at least keep road facilities operating the first winter following fire and thereafter, which might require relocating road crossings, culverts, upgrading or upsizing their capacity, and the such, as mentioned earlier around about roads. Remember, M&Ms is basically the importance of monitoring and maintaining practices and being watchful of the post wildfire burn landscape for problems to occur, and be ready to call in the experts if necessary, or to treat those areas or to monitor those areas. And then number 1 is to realize that there is no silver bullet, and that it's important to have an emergency plan if you're living on a burn landscape. And don't forget to include pets and livestock in that emergency plan. And hopefully you'll make it through the first winter. If you had the lake fire impact your property in some way, and for many winters to come. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for some questions if there's anybody still out there.
Great, thank you, Rich. Yeah, we still have some people out here. Thank you so much for these tips. It's hard to know where to start, and I'm sure that people will sell you anything.
Yes, a lot of ambulance chasers out there. Some of them are very well intended, but some of them clearly do not know what they're doing. I mean, I've given talks to contractors thinking they were going to, oil and feather me. And turns out they come up to me afterwards and say, Rich, this information was unbelievable. I've been doing the wrong thing for 20 years. So it's good that we can get to some contractors with some of this information so that they can fine tune the work that they're doing for some of these property owners that we'll never reach.
Mhm. Yes, and some of the suggestions that you give seem to be very practical and realistic, and also following up with them. So not a one and done or a silver bullet, which I really appreciate. I have a question here, just a couple questions. Maybe we'll take 5 minutes before we wrap it up. This is Frank. At Sedgwick Reserve, the lake fire burned many hundreds of acres of chamise, buckbrush chaparral, and purple sage California sagebrush scrub. Both types had not burned in many decades and burned relatively hot. Would you recommend, for example, let nature do its work, apply equally to both chaparral and sage scrub, or would you approach fire recovery really different in those vegetation types? Incorporating
I,
different.
I always want to give nature the first crack at it, give nature a chance, and not really knowing or microscoping the soil to know how much of that plant is really dead even below the surface, or what seed bank might be in the soil, before we help out nature too much here. And I know that some of these plants have a higher hazard rating than others, as well, in terms of going forward, because these areas seem to regenerate more quickly than we think, and sometimes more than we expect. So I would say hold off, and like I said, anything that you were to do in terms of even putting shrub plantings or shrub seed back on the landscape, the areas that burn that hot generally have a significant ash layer, and you can't really seed ash. So you kind of have to wait for some of that ash layer to wash away before any seed would take. And seeding is only as good as the seedbed preparation that goes along with it. So seed success is really dependent on cover. So you'd need like a half an inch of some sort of cover over that seed bed, as well as timing. So a lot of those things are not possible when you seed in uh, January. Not timing in particular, but in the middle of the winter, none of this is going to help us the first winter anyway. Even native grasses are probably not going to be much help unless we get into significant spring rains. They'll do us a great help in the second winter following fire. But most anything that we put on the landscape, if it's not what's already growing there, we're going to slow down what we eventually want to be growing there. So I wouldn't be recommending even sterile wheat in these chamise, buckbrush areas to at least get something on the surface of the ground. A lot of those areas that haven't burned in 100 years have a lot of loose sediment on the soil, the dry ravel. You can't seed that. It's going to mobilize no matter what. So we're going to have to live with some surface soil erosion, but some of that surface soil erosion is going to be nothing more than the sediments eroding, sediments that are not going to be able to produce any plant material until it erodes away, basically. So I would say, let's give nature a chance as a sort of as a general question. As I said earlier, there may be some site-specific cases where we could do some replanting. We have an opportunity. We have this wonderful post-fire laboratory there and a research facility to do some experiments, if you will, and may help us with other fires that may occur or will occur in the future, whether it be in Santa Barbara County or elsewhere in California.
Yes, the recovery aspect of this realm of research seems like it's really lacking, so that could be helpful.
It is lacking. Um, Even setting up erosion bridges and monitoring erosion bridges in the field on different soil types, on different land, vegetation types, on different steepness of slopes, in areas where, debris flows may be a hazard, might offer some opportunity for us in the future in regards to potential for erosion in these areas after all this vegetation, grows back. We're not going to know. We have an opportunity right now that we won't have, a year from now.
Thank you. I have another question here from Kim. She gives some background and context here. Any information that you might point me to regarding how California homeowner associations may be preparing financially for wildfire recovery in the appropriate ways, as you're explaining for us? My HOA is a developed 800+ acre ranch with 40+ lots in Santa Ynez Valley high fire zone. We own 10 miles of paved roads and our own water company. Many of the practices you're discussing would certainly be necessary if the wildfire burned very widely here, or as the fire department cautions, when a wildfire burns through here. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any reserve funds for wildfire recovery other than repairing road surfaces. Thank you for a very informative presentation.
Okay, thank you for that question. I commend you for having a homeowners association because oftentimes I meet with neighborhoods that don't have any formal association or long and winding, unpaved, you know, private roads that have no road association. So I commend you for having an association. Having said that, I'll speak from experience. I now know I not only live within a homeowners association, but I'm president of a homeowners association. I'm also a road manager of a private road that winds through this road association. Fortunately, we only have 5 properties, you know, on less than 100 acres within that homeowners association. But nonetheless, we are all concerned about fire hazard reduction. In fact, with the exception of our homeowners association and where we are located in Santa Cruz County, all of our neighbors have had their fire insurance policies canceled. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with me or with our homeowners association. We keep waiting for that other shoe to drop, but so far so good. So what are we doing, and what resources are we availing ourselves as a homeowners association to fire hazard reduction? First and foremost, we try to have a meeting at least once a year. Probably should do it more often than that. We do through remote ways, particularly when there's some urgency. Having said that, the first thing we were all concerned about was emergency access and knowing where to go in the event there was a fire, and is our road safe to exit our properties, and or if fire affected our road, we are one way in and one way out. How do we exit, and where is our safe harbor? And that includes a PG&E access route that can include walking out, but by knowing where to walk and not just walk directly into a fire. But nevertheless, we have come up with a design and a plan as to what we would do if we had to exit our properties during a wildfire. We have wildfire on our agenda in terms of fire hazard reduction and abatement on every single homeowners association agenda. Just 2 days ago, I wrote a check from our association bank account to a tree service for $3,800, removing trees from our water system and water pipes that serve all of our collective properties, to provide not only access, but also a fire hazard reduction zone around our water tanks. We collect $200 from everyone every 3 months, and it just goes into a kitty for such things as what I just wrote a check for, and for anything that might be necessary on our road. That amount could be changed if we end up saving too much money, but no one has had any issue with this. We started that account 12 years ago, and it's helped to be a reserve for us for fire hazard reduction, for our well and water system, and for road resurfacing, and as I mentioned, for anything else that might come up. We have also taken advantage of the Resource Conservation District's chipper program, whereby we did the work to chip or to cut the brush, and we lay it out along our road, and that's a free service in our county, and a chipper comes along and chips it, and everyone has access to the chips, or they can take the chips away. But that's a free service. Every county is different when it comes to something like that. But we do try to search out what might be low cost or no cost to homeowners, because homeowners associations don't always have the same opportunities as a county or a city or a legal subdivision. Some road associations, I understand, are legal subdivisions of state government and have the ability to apply for grants. So I'm not quite sure about yours, but that's something to look into. But again, I have information that I can send to you about road associations, and if you're interested, my email is up on the screen, so you can email me at any time or use it for future reference. If something comes up, I'd be happy to respond to you by email. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's me. I always give long-winded answers.
Sounds like you're in the middle of it. I have two questions that I'm going to kind of combine from Andy and Bonnie. Bonnie says that she lives on Figueroa Mountain Road and the fire burned up by the homes where their properties and where she lives. How can she find an expert to advise us? It's similar to Andy's question. How can one become a certified erosion control planner?
Um, Without giving you the actual website, I don't have it at my fingertips, but there's two ways of learning more about the certification program. The letters C as in Charlie, P as in Peter, E as in Edward, S as in Sam, and C as in Charlie again, cpesc.org, or EnviroCert. Just basically Google EnviroCert, EnviroCert. It will give you information about how to apply for certification and eligibility requirements of that program, but it also will give you a list of everyone that's certified in the world. Since this thing went international at one time, as you can see well, maybe you couldn't see it, but from my introductory slide, I was the third person certified under this program because I co-founded it back in 1982 after about a 5-year program of getting it to that point. But having said that, there are now over 45,000 certified professionals in over 45 countries around the world, recognizing the certification as a standalone expertise, which didn't have that reputation before 1982. Anybody could put up their sign and be a so-called self-proclaimed erosion control specialist. Having said that, you can, on that website, narrow down that list of certified specialists to Santa Barbara County and find out who might be certified in Santa Barbara County and who is doing private consulting there. A lot of engineering firms and geologic firms have people on staff that are certified. NRCS used to have a lot, but I hate to say it, not that many anymore. I don't know if it's since I retired 7 years ago, became a contractor, or just because they work for NRCS and they don't need to be certified. But nonetheless, NRCS may be a source of free assistance for a consultation for the same thing you would be asking an erosion control specialist of. And their office is in Santa Maria.
Oh, that's good. It's nearby. I have a final question here from Frank. In your experience, do existing public policies support your approach to recovery from wildfires? Are there any policy reforms that you would recommend to us to reduce the risk of wildfire damage, including wildfire suppression strategies? and assist with recovery from wildfires?
Not that I know of, and that's an excellent question. It's something on my things to do list. Um, each agency, unfortunately, has their own policy and approach. The Forest Service, CAL FIRE, local fire agencies, um, counties, cities, NRCS, UC Cooperative Extension. I've always wanted to like combine all of that, because one of my big take-home messages has always been that we need to be speaking with a unified voice, and not to confuse landowners and the public as to what to do, what not to do, when to wait, when not to wait. Everyone has a slightly different angle on that, and it can be very confusing if you go to more than one of these sources for information. And all those sources I mentioned are all free services. Now, when you go to the private sectors usually have some sort of vested or biased interest in helping you. They want the job, they get money, blah, blah, blah. So whenever you can get an unbiased, non-vested, opinion, that's a good place to start. NRCS is one of those places. The Resource Conservation District is another. And so they don't do the work, they don't sell anything, and it doesn't cost anything. So I always tell people, do your due diligence, get as much good information as you can to help you make an informed decision. And don't base your decision on what the neighbor did or what subcontractor advised you to do before it's too late, or that sort of thing. That's one reason in my talk I go through some of the overarching concepts and strategies, so that in the back of your mind you have some ammunition to help you go through those weeds when you're approaching other organizations or the private sector for help.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rich.
You're welcome.
It's great. It's very informative. Thank you so much for everyone for attending. Share the resources with your neighbors and friends. Spread it as widely as you can. And we thank you so much for an informative talk this night. Thank you so much, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Good night.